Welcome to AGAPE Social Justice, where we focus on love, truth, and justice. Today's episode is actually going to be pretty personal for me today, and maybe even vulnerable for my guest. Today I have with me my husband, retired trooper Walt Kreider. And so I am looking forward to sharing with you the Black law enforcement officer perspective. So for many people, they have not heard this type of conversation before from a retiree. And so I highly encourage that you go ahead, call your friends, call your family, because this is an episode you want to tune in and listen to. Well, thanks for joining us today. It feels a little weird.
Like I had a choice. Come on.
But I'm glad you are here because seriously, there are a lot of people who are always trying to figure out where Black officers stand. And so I want you to not only start out talking about what made you become a law enforcement officer in the first place, and then what your experience has been on the job in this profession, and then we'll kind of go into some of the other questions that people have.
All right. Well, first, thanks for having me. Certainly, it's my pleasure to share my information and whatnot, my experience. But it all began as a child. I grew up in Highland Park, and regardless of what people may think of Highland Park today or where Highland Park may happen to find itself, it was an era where it was, I call it an epoch in time, where Highland Park was in a transition from that of a predominantly European or white community to that of an African American community. Our infrastructure was in place in terms of we still had Chrysler, we had Ford, we had our own water source, and now in 1968, we had the first actually African American mayor in all of Michigan. And it wasn't Coleman Young, it was Bob Blackwell. So African Americans came into power within the city of Highland Park. And with that, law enforcement began to change in terms of the complexion. You had more African American police officers now in the city. Those people were living in the city. They were our scoutmasters. They were our football coaches. They were instrumental within the upbringing of us as young people. So growing up, I didn't necessarily revere the police, but I respected them because they were community figures and whatnot. So it wasn't a far stretch that when the opportunity to get involved in law enforcement, that it wasn't appealing. It was appealing because of my experience that I had. I mean, I didn't have any negative experiences with the police in Highland Park. Now, when we talk about moving outside of our small community, that's another story altogether. But that's what really led me into police work. I was at Wayne State, and I was doing an internship at a probation office, and I was reading police reports and compiling what we call pre-sentence reports that the judge would read and whatnot. And I'm reading all these police reports, and I'm typing up stuff, and I'm saying, wow, it sounds interesting. That sounds something that I could do, so on and so forth. And then it was also a love of the community for the city of Highland Park. I saw that as an opportunity in terms of getting involved in law enforcement to actually be a force, a change agent within my community, Highland Park. So that's where it all started with the city of Highland Park and becoming a police officer.
That makes sense. Actually, what you just said, I actually heard it differently today in terms of being able to envision what it was like at that time when they are people who are well respected in the community. They're a part of your lives. Today, it feels a little bit more forced, like, trying to get them to move into the community and get to know you. But so that does make sense. I can see how that can lead you to want to go into law enforcement. And then your father was a probation officer.
Correct. Right. So he was on that side of the street in terms of pro law enforcement. But at the same time, he wasn't blind to what law enforcement could possibly, or what law enforcement represented in the African American community for some people outside of Highland Park. Because one of the things he always used to tell me was that, cops are just another gang. They just wear a different color.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Elaborate on that.
Meaning that it was a close-knit community and that they had their own rule structure and that it was hard to penetrate within that group and that that they would close ranks quickly, whether around you or whether forcing you out or something like that. So he saw law enforcement for what it represented to the African American community. again, outside of Highland Park. And I'm sure we had our issues in Highland Park with the police. I know we did, but I'm talking about within that golden era, as I like to call it, in HP, me coming up as a young person, the police were our friends.
So when you were in Highland Park, you were what was considered a public safety officer, right?
Right. Fast forward into actually becoming the police. Yeah, I was trained firefighter, EMT, and a police officer.
Okay. So then at what point did you decide that you wanted to transition from being a public safety officer to then going into state police?
Well, Highland Park was a great place to start. But I looked at the Michigan State Police as just who the Michigan State Police are. The lead law enforcement agency in the state of Michigan, and it presented a great challenge for me. It was a personal thing that I wanted to accomplish and I wanted to conquer. Not so much that I wanted to travel around the state and all that type of thing. I enjoyed law enforcement. I found that was a niche for me in Highland Park, but becoming a state trooper was something that it was a goal. It was something that if I accomplished, it would make me that much better of a person.
That's interesting. Okay. And how did you feel that it would make you better as a person? And then the follow-up to that is once you got into MSP, what was your experience? And do you feel like you grew through through your career?
Oh, challenges always, we always grow through challenges. And it's actually in our defeats that we actually ascend to a higher level. It's not what you do once you reach the top, but it's what you do on your way to the top. It's the stumbling blocks and all of those type of things. So I saw becoming a state trooper as, the ultimate challenge that would challenge me, not just as an individual, but as a professional as it relates to being in law enforcement.
So walk us through what that looked like. So you decide you want to be a Michigan State Trooper. What was the process for you?
Well, I didn't have any military background, and the Detroit Metropolitan Police Academy, it was certainly a challenge, but I knew that the Michigan State Police Academy was probably akin to something like the Marines,
Oh, wow.
which I didn't have any experience with. So it was like, I'm going into an environment that I have no experience with, and I'm going to have to do the best that I can do in terms of preparation. And that's what we did. I prepared for about a year and went through the background investigation and all of that kind of stuff, and then make it to the academy. And the academy at that time was about 4.5 months, and it was rigorous, but we came prepared and we succeeded.
Is it still 4.5 months now?
Oh, it's 6 months now.
6 months now.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like the training that you received at that time prepared you for what you experienced on the job?
It prepared me from a mental standpoint to be able to endure the rigors of what one might experience emotionally in terms of the stress of the job, at least temporarily. It did not prepare me in terms of what was out there as it relates to what some of the big talking points now in law enforcement is that of mental health. No, it didn't prepare me to be a mental health professional, but certainly it prepared me to deal with some of the stress that was going to come my way, because the academy, and just like any elite military force, the training that you endure, you always, in a critical situation, you always falter or fall to your level of training. So if your level of training is up here and you encounter a situation in terms of a critical situation, you're going to go only this far. But if your training is below level, guess what? When the stuff hits the fan, you're going to fall all the way to that level, and now you're not going to be able to react appropriately and maybe even hurt somebody or hurt yourself. So the training, prepared me for some of the stress that was out there on the job.
So after the training, you're on a job, you realize that there's some things out there that you're going to experience that you're not equipped for. What do you do then? Like, can you go to your command staff and say, hey, we need this additional training? Or is the culture of just, get out there and make do with it?
Well, see, law enforcement, there's a lot of bravado in it. And not just from a male perspective, because in law enforcement, you don't necessarily assimilate, you inculcate into their system. So it's a system, it's macho, bravado, it's male dominated, all that type of thing. So you adopt the attitude that I can handle it. Whether or not you can, I can handle this stuff. Until you really become wise enough to realize that, oh, this is really beyond the scope of what I'm trained for. And more importantly, I need to seek some type of intervention in terms of the next time that I go into a situation like this. But in the beginning, a young officer, you enjoy those type of challenges. Whether you make the right decision or not, you enjoy being confronted with those type of challenges that, that you've never experienced before, or it's going to take you to another level, or you're going to have to make those critical decisions. So
the enjoyment part of it, is it curiosity? Is it an adrenaline rush? Like, what is it? Explain it.
It's a lot of it is adrenaline, and I don't want to say the reality is this, but in terms of from a survival perspective, surviving out there, and maybe that's the wrong way that we look at law enforcement. I go out there and I have to survive. And really, and we'll talk about that later in terms of we really need to go out there with a mindset of service and servitude versus that of survival. But from a survival standpoint, it's adrenaline that keeps you in the game because, fear can be managed. It can work against you or it can work for you. So once you really learn how to channel the fear, channel the adrenaline, for lack of a better word, it's a drug.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a drug. If you don't seek the monster ends up destroying you.
So is it true that the training that's received today still instills this kind of fear in officers for survival when they go out? Like, is that in the forefront of their mind every time they have an encounter, whether it's a traffic stop or any other type of interaction?
I believe that's something that's always in the forefront of an individual's mind, whether or not they react to it or whether they communicate that yes, you are focused on returning home, because that's one of the things. Make it safe, make it home. Now, yes, that is great advice by all means, because we didn't take this job to die. However, what you're looking for and what I'm looking for now, because I'm a civilian, I'm looking for an individual actually to provide some type of service and, if need be, become that hero to rescue my situation from some type of impending danger. So our survival as it relates to law enforcement needs to be trained as it's a secondary need. Your survival is secondary to that of protection and safety of the community. That's the paradigm shift that needs to really take place. And
did you see that though? Did you see that in the career?
Like I say, watch TV. It says, make it safe. Well, make it safe is actually my term, and I'm saying when I say make it safe, I mean go out there and make the community safe. But you see on Hill Street Blues, that type of thing. Be safe out there, and that's really in terms of the focus is on you. You be safe.
So what did you see with the vast majority of the people that you work with, whether, not just within your agency, your department, but in law enforcement in general? What did you see on the job? What was the mindset of the majority of people?
Some people ended up in law enforcement by accident. And I was one of those individuals. I was a criminal justice major, that type of thing. Like I say, I'm reading I'm creating pre-sentence reports in a probation office, and it's like, oh, that's something I might be able to do. And one thing led to another. So I stumbled into law enforcement. Other people look at it from a perspective of my dad, my granddad, and so on and so forth. It's a career that I'm destined to. And then you have those individuals that come in and they're really altruistic in terms of I come to serve the community. I come to be that advocate. So you have those varying groups, within that of law enforcement. And what I found is that you had the individual that really came to serve was probably a better police officer from the standpoint of they were less likely to engage individuals and escalate a situation beyond that of control. And that's the essence of police work, unfortunately. it's a battle of control. From the time that you encounter an individual, it's all about establishing control. And that's probably a learned behavior because, for myself personally, I found myself in a situation, happy-go-lucky, encountering the community. Almost got cold cocked a couple times because I was happy-go-lucky, so on and so forth. And quickly I learned that you have to establish control if you want to maintain that safety. And what we see today in terms of the confrontations with police officers or these unfortunate situations is that they're battling for control with the public. And see, right now where we are as citizens and whatnot, we have been empowered by the knowledge of what the police can and can't do. We now have social media on our side. So guess what? I do know my rights. You know what I mean? And I don't want to say that's intimidating, but that's an affront to a lot of people that are in authority, police officers. Oh, you know your rights, okay? I'm going to show you your rights. The next thing you know, it goes back and forth. And now we have a critical incident.
So one of the things that we hear all the time in the community is the problem is just a few bad apples. Is it just a few bad apples?
I used to say this while recruiting because I did a lot of recruiting for the Michigan State Police. And I would say that law enforcement, police officers, that we are the keepers of the American way. And I would say this in a group setting and whatnot. And people thought I was really being patriotic, you know what I mean? So on and so forth. But what I was really saying is that law enforcement, that our job, law enforcement's job, is to preserve the American way. See, the issue in terms of whether or not the police are right or wrong, or if the system is broken, the police are protecting a broken system, unfortunately. They're enforcing the laws of a broken system that, unfortunately, or shall I say, for the betterment of society as a whole, is coming to light now.
And when you say broken system, explain to people what you mean.
Well, I mean, in terms of America, the situations, the problems that we have that are being uncovered, with law enforcement, in America, in terms of systemic racism and biases and so on and so forth. And I'm not, but by all means, I'm not trying to cast aspersions upon the red, white, and blue and the stars and stripes, but it's no secret that we do have our issues in America, and law enforcement is there to preserve that.
So I've had conversations with people, particularly Christians, who tend to believe that social justice activists have kind of hyped this up, that this isn't really a reality because their experience with law enforcement has been very different than my experience with law enforcement, which, as you know, I grew up having experiences when we moved to, an affluent suburban community. I was followed then. When I've been pulled over, people have said things to me that are disrespectful that other moms didn't have the police saying to them. And so because they haven't had those experiences, they oftentimes don't believe me. They don't believe other activists who are telling them what's going on. What message would you say to them in terms of the truth and the reality of what some of us experience when we have encounters with law enforcement?
Well, sometimes when we talk about a system that's been perpetuated with that of individuals that really don't deserve to be the police or be in public safety, and then they move up to management, and then they go ahead and they recruit other individuals like-minded, and that continues to perpetuate. And now you have a system or a systemic problem in terms of what was at the top is now throughout the entire organization. Yes, you do have law enforcement agencies where you have a problem from the top to the bottom, that unfortunately take advantage of their authority, their power. Abraham Lincoln said, all men can endure adversity, but if you really want to test a man's character, give him power. There's some people out there, there's some agencies out there, there's some entire agencies out there that abuse that power. Mm-hmm. But then, like myself, I was fortunate, even within the city of Highland Park, that I worked with some great officers. I saw some stuff, never participated in it, but I saw some stuff with the Michigan State Police. I'm born again. I'm a child of God. I worked on a midnight shift. We must have had 8 guys that were born again. And guess what? If you got in their back seat, you heard a gospel message. Whether or not we were violating the law, who cares? But what I'm talking about is that it was that level of humanity that came forth through the individual police officer.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, that's how I'm kind of solid and confident when I tell people this is not a situation where all cops are bad. Because
Right.
I happen to know a lot, not just, am I married to an officer, which by the way, is obviously is no secret to you, but there was a time when I would have never ever considered even dating an officer because of my experiences. But now today, because I have friends who were protectors, in these agencies, I can tell people that everybody is not bad. But one of the questions that I always get is, well, Stephanie, if that's true, why aren't Black officers speaking up in these agencies and making change? So I want to present that question to you. What does that look like when you all see systemic racism, when you see misconduct, when you see police brutality? What happens when you all see that?
Again, it's not a matter of assimilation, it's a matter of inculcation. And some people will inculcate into the organization. I had a situation on the road where they talk about the blue curtain or the blue wall or whatever, the wall of silence, blue silence or whatever. And that's true. There's a brotherhood for some individuals, and they stick by that brotherhood. I had a situation on the road with the Michigan State Police where an off-duty police officer got into a car wreck with a civilian, and then he was drunk and he pistol whipped this person, right? So we get to run because it came out as an accident. We get there, end up having to call the ambulance. This guy had been pistol whipped, and he said, that's so-and-so. He was a police officer. So lo and behold, that police officer returns to the scene. He's off duty. He's drunk, right? Guy points him out. I go up there, investigate, end up grabbing the guy's badge. And because of the politics that were involved, because of where we were and the department that he worked for, it could have actually caused a situation. So using a little, being strategic about it, the police department, they have what they call a duty officer, and that's a person that runs the entire department after hours. You just don't call up the chief in the middle of the night and say, hey, chief, we have a situation. They have what they call a duty officer that really runs the entire department at night. So we make a phone call to the duty officer. That duty officer comes out there and he deals with it, get a guy's badge, and then we leave. Lo and behold, I ended up having to go to court, and I had to testify against the guy.
But is that common?
I've seen with some internal affairs situations where police officers have done that, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't occur as often as it should.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as often as, and to be quite frank, not to put myself on a pedestal or anything like that, but what really came to mind when in the middle of that situation is, I'm not going to sacrifice my career for yours. You were wrong. You know what I mean?
So in the what we just saw play out throughout the pandemic, right? Obviously, that's not anything new, but we were all home. We all were kind of, in a sense, forced to see the reality of what's been happening in law enforcement. Social media, the use of cell phone usage, it just kind of magnified what was going on. And we saw one incident after another, after another, after another. And people took to the streets. And I think our society is still struggling with, this realization that this is what law enforcement also is, right? What do we need to do? If you could pinpoint in the brief time we have left, if you could pinpoint what we can do to address this institutional system that perpetuates the behavior, how can we move forward?
Well, But let's first look at the name, because the thing is what you call it. I mean, a dog is a dog, a cat is a cat, so on and so forth. Well, I mean, police, unfortunately, you know, carries negative connotation. It has bad history behind it. What are we concerned about in America? What are we concerned about as individual citizens? What am I concerned about? I'm concerned about safety, public safety. So let's transform the police to what we are all, what we're all, what we all want, and that is protection. Police to protectors.
So switching gears into police to protectors. So we just launched a nonprofit recently, which because of you and because of this mindset, we call it Police, the number 2, Protectors.
Yes.
And that is shifting from the mindset of policing to protecting,
Yes.
right? What message do you want to convey? If you had one single message that you could give to law enforcement and could give to the community as we close out, what would that message be?
The message to law enforcement is that this is a collective effort. Is that we have to not only protect the community, but we have to band together with the community. And that's the same thing for the community as a whole. Is that I'm not the police, I am your police. I am your protector. And when we take ownership for the community and the community takes ownership for that of law enforcement, I think that we're on a path of correction.
I agree. I actually want to make sure that we also state this, that you haven't always had this mindset in terms of where you are today. You had an experience with a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours now, but many years ago, you had a paradigm shift. Do you want to share that?
Real good friend of mine, Dale Brown, and you probably know him as an internet sensation in terms of the defensive tactics guru on YouTube. We've been friends 22 years now. And what happened is that I was a community service trooper, and that was a position where I engaged the community in terms of churches, community groups, all of that kind of stuff. And in my presentations, I would bring Dale on board, and Dale and I would interact. But Dale, who obviously deserves his own interview, just brought forth a paradigm shift in terms of my mindset from that of police to that of being a protector in terms of what we actually owe the community, from being of a crime fighter to that of a servant and a protector.
Yeah. I think service, protection, provider, those are all words that kind of resonate with me. I think that's what the community is looking for. I'd actually like to continue this conversation, and maybe we even do a part 2, could just to drill a little bit deeper in terms of what law enforcement looks like today. And on the flip side of that, what law enforcement officers experience on the job themselves as it relates to mental health, and not just how the mentally ill are treated by law enforcement in our community. So I'd like to have you come back. For our listening audience, I do want you to go ahead and visit our nonprofit's website. Again, it's called Police to Protectors, the number 2. So if you go to policetoprotectors.org, you'll see our story in terms of how we began to take this journey together, the mission that we're on. We're hoping that one day we can create a definition for public safety for the state of Michigan so that they can simply do what we want, and that is to shift from policing to protecting. Until next time, we appreciate you tuning in. Feel free to share this episode with other people you know, because the more we share and the more we make people aware, the more we can grow together and we can take the actions we need to take. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.